Hello, I'm Ben. Welcome to the channel. So today we're going to talk about, it's October, and in October every year, we have Halloween that comes up at the end of the month, and there's a lot of discussion back and forth about should people participate and do these things. Here's my suggestion. I think people should not celebrate evil with demonic things like witches and demons and things of that nature. However, there are lessons to be taught about scary things in every culture, and there have been since the dawn of time. That's where mythology comes from, and some of these things like Krampus and those type things were told as cautionary tales to make people act right and do right. So in Ephesians 5, verse 11 through 14, this will be the King James Version, of course, it says, "And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. For it's a shame to even speak of those things which are done of them in secret. But all things that are reproved are made manifest by the light. For whatsoever doth make manifest is light. Wherefore he saith, Awake, thou sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give thee light." So it says in that verse, have no fellowship with unfruitful works of darkness. So when you talk about Halloween and the Day of the Dead and the things that cultures do around the world, some of those things are exceedingly dark. But there's a different way that you can allow your family to participate in things that are creepy, that actually serve a purpose. So from a preparatory standpoint, or from a standpoint where you're preparing them for the evils of the world, because the worst things, the scariest things, the most evil thing I've ever seen came from the hands of people. It looked just like you or me. It wasn't a boogeyman. It wasn't some demon or devil. It was a human being that decided to be a plague on life on this planet. And it's a group of human beings that sustain that even through till today. So when you talk about evil in my mind, I'm not thinking about some creature lurking under the bed. I'm thinking of people like ISIL or Daesh, that went around killing people in their homes. I think about what still we left over there in Afghanistan and the Taliban and what those folks do to people. So there's a lot that you can read in the Bible about evil. And about participating in evil. On this one page, it's got 48 verses that suggest about participating in evil. It said, "Let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except for God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." So it's talking about government. 5:11, once again, is take no part in unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. In John 18:36, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not in this world." So he was supposed to die and be the sacrifice for us and go on. Deuteronomy 18, verse 10 through 12 says, "There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or his daughter as an offering, anyone who participates in divination or tells fortune or interprets omens, for a sorcerer or a charmer, or a medium or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord." So that's the part that really is talking about the evil. So let me read that again. This is Deuteronomy 18, 10 through 12. And I don't know why this site always goes ESV. It doesn't go King James for me. So it says, "There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or daughter as an offering, anyone who practices a divination or tells fortunes, or interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or a charmer, or a medium, or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead," like seances and things like that. "For whosoever does these things is abomination to the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you." So those are the things that are evil. Okay? But here's the thing. There's plenty of things on this planet that are scary and evil that actually does serve a purpose for us to prep and try to stay in front of and stay around. So you could participate with your kids and your family if you want to do something creepy this time of year and not be participating in evil things. And I have a couple things here to discuss that. So let's talk about cryptozoology. Cryptozoology is a pseudoscience and subculture that searches and studies for unknown, legendary, or extinct animals who present existence or disputed or unsubstantiated things that are presently present, particularly those popular in folklore, such as Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, Yeti, Chupacabra, the Jersey Devil, the Mokele Mimbe, which is a huge spider, I think. Cryptozoologists refer to these entities as cryptids, a term that coined a subculture because it does not follow the scientific method, which that's false. That's false. Some things do follow the scientific method. So let's talk about this. Gorillas, for example. So you talk about gorillas in the mist. There was a movie that was made about gorillas in the mist back in the 80s. And in that, they follow a real-life scientist in finding gorillas that were supposed to be false. It was gorillas that were not supposed to be there. And there are some doctors that thought if they went out there and looked in the Congo and the Democratic Republic of the Congo at the time in Tanzania, that they possibly could find these. Dr. Jane Goodall is the one that is the famous character of the story, and the story is brutal, but it's scary stuff. And what's great about that, though, is if you study gorillas and you study chimpanzees, there were some that were found that were supposed to be cryptids that did not exist. The bonobo, for example, has certain characteristics and traits that are kind of interesting, and they're very much different from the chimpanzees that look very much like. So much that most people can't tell them apart. But the bonobos have a lifestyle that is very different, relatively different. What's great about the gorillas and the bonobos and those type things, they were once thought to be crypto creatures. The mountain gorilla, for one, was supposed to be something that didn't exist in the area it was supposed to be in. There was just vegetation. They were thinking food would not be there for the animal. Also, in jungles, you have the jungle bongo. It's spelled B-O-N-G-O. Look it up. It's something that weighs over 1,000 pounds. And for the last 100 years, it was considered to be a cryptid, something that was false. There's no antelope that can live in the jungle like that. There's nothing that big. And sure enough, this twisted horn antelope was found, 20, 30 years ago. And now they're hunted on tags and are legal to hunt. The reason I mention that is the biggest story in North America is Bigfoot, right? And in China, they have the Yeti, and this creature is all over the planet, and it looks the same, and people are interested. Some of the best books I've found on that are The Hoopa Project. Okay, this is by a gentleman, David Pilatus, who is a former investigator, and some of the stories in this book are pretty wild. And the point about David Pilatus and what he does, though, is the people that tell him their stories, typically they're pretty good people. They don't have a reason to lie. There's no benefit to them from doing this. And he has signed affidavits. There's police officers, there's EMTs, local just business owners, etc. that are not capitalizing or trying to capitalize off of the story, but have the stories to tell just the same. The reason I walk down this path is to say, if you want to do something creepy in October so your kids don't feel left out, you don't have to talk about demonology or witches or witchcraft or any of that jazz. You can talk about cryptids and science, and you look into crime, but once you get into crime, you're getting back into the evil piece, because people are extremely evil at times, and that's something I would say you want to try to stay away from, because you want to try to save purity as long as you can in your kids. And so telling scary stories, it doesn't have to be about murder and the other things that awful people do. It can be about some of these things. So the next book I would suggest that's called Tribal Bigfoot. One of the best Bigfoot stories I've ever read is actually in this book. It's very entertaining. And I read this stuff because I'm an outdoorsman, but also I find this stuff very entertaining. And David Pilatus, he does, I believe his stories. I believe the people that are talking to him believe that they saw these things and think that. And here's the thing. When you've been out in the wilderness, you've been out beyond city borders. If you've hiked the Appalachian Trail or, Pacific Coast Trail or any of these long trails, you're not going to see Bigfoot on those places because there's so many people there. But if you've hunted private trails on private property and you've hiked miles in on wild land that is not publicly beat down, and you don't have 4,000 trekkers going up and down that every 6 months. Now you're talking about a possibility of not just seeing Bigfoot, but be seeing other game, bears, deer, elk, moose, whatever it may be. The less traveled stuff is where you see things. One of the cool things about reading Dr. Jane Goodall's books, and I have several. I think I have 12 or 15 of them over there. And that's the doctor that is talked about in, this is one story from her backline in Gorillas of the Mist, is she talks about when they went to go in and find chimpanzees, because if they could study the chimpanzees, they maybe could go in and find the mountain ape, which they ultimately did. But what she said in that book was that they had to hike in as a group 13 miles further in from the farthest trail, the farthest path. So let's say there's a city that's out here, a town rather, a village of sorts, 20 hutches, no electricity, no water, typically on the banks of a river is how that works. And so from the farthest trail that those people used, the farthest hunting trail that those people used out into the wilderness, they went 13 miles in, between 10 and 16 miles. So 13 miles in from there, and decided to set up an observation deck and hang out there for a bit, being quiet, trying not to leave a footprint, trying to control their scent, trying to control their noise. It still took 60 days before they saw the first chimp. 60 days. So they had to sit in the woods for 2 months not seeing a thing, smelling, stinking, covering up their scent as best they could with what they had near there. And it took 60 days before they saw a chimp. So what's interesting about that suggestion is that a Bigfoot, if it's like-minded, or a Sasquatch or whatever, if it's like-minded, these people that think they're going to run into it in the backyard, then, But my thought is this. If it's anything like an adolescent buck, right? When the buck's in a rut, they do stupid stuff, man. So also, there's some people that are pretty stupid. So you would think there's outliers in every group of organisms. So maybe that's the case, and maybe that's why people see, Bigfoot in the Pizza Hut parking lot. But at the end of the day, it all makes for interesting, creepy reading. And honestly, if you want something that can get quite creepy, this book does. And it's not evil. It's talking about an animal that may exist, that is something to consider and something scary. The next is, jerks at work. People are awful. That's some scary stuff sometimes. People feel a lot more stress about this every year than they do about Bigfoot. I guarantee you that much. There's a lot of people that can't sleep at night and all that because of jerks at work. So you probably have some scary stories there with some awful bosses or people who are difficult to deal with on a daily basis. So I say some of this guy's jokingly, but some of this, there's other ways that you don't have to be studying things that are evil or doing things that are evil to participate in the fanfare of the holiday, which is Halloween. And it's an American holiday, which means, there's a lot of pull for your kids to participate. So in that, they don't have to be participating in demonic things. There's a lot of folks that say that Christians shouldn't particularly participate in any secular stuff. I disagree with that. It's the world we live in. So the world you live in, you have to be a part of, because that's how you influence and impact others. How are you going to impact people if you are socially only hanging out with people that believe the way you do? If you're only hanging out with Christians and people that don't participate in all this other, then you won't have the opportunity to talk to folks that may need the message that you have. So there's a way to participate in things and not doing it in a demonic way is my suggestion, based on what I read you earlier on what the Bible says and what evil is. So let's talk about some other things that are creepy, and you can come up with some strange stories then. This is Myths and Tales from the American Indians. So I always find it funny when we call our ancestors Indians, because basically one white guy landed here and said, these are Indians, thinking he's in India. Well, they weren't. They're American natives. My family is American native. We have Catawba Indian blood in us. But some of the stories in here are scary. And, for instance, people talk about shapeshifters and all that, werewolves specifically. That's something that comes from native culture in America and also elsewhere in the world. Elsewhere in the world, they also have shapeshifters, but they don't necessarily call them what we do here based on their folklore. So here is short stories from around the world that has to deal with some of that. It's classic tales. Some of this stuff is imaginative and creative. So in this, you have Ambrose Bierce, Leo Tolstoy, Arthur Conan Doyle, O. Henry, Anton Chekhov, and many, many others. So some of the stories in here can be very, very creepy. Edgar Allan Poe is a good thing that you can read during this season, and he just likes the dread of what awaits us all. Illness and death are the scariest things in his stories. He talks some about madmen, but a lot of it is about just the mental stress of being alone in dark places that are unfamiliar. So that's a good way to go. And of course, here's a book that I picked up recently, The First People's Stories. So this is stories from tribes from around the world. A lot of creation stories. I've read most of the creation stories from around the world. I have 2 or 3 books dedicated to that because it's just interesting to see how far from the Bible those stories are. And you'd be surprised. Some of them aren't that far from what we believe. And the next is, myths and legends from mythology. Now, this was at one point religion. So you are studying other people's religion, but there's some spooky, scary stuff in here and scary creatures, all of which are not specifically evil or demonic. They're just creatures living in their way in their world. So that's a pretty good book. Sword fighting and all that's pretty creepy and pretty scary too if you're not a good sword fighter. But I'll tell you one of the things that people are horrified of, and it's just as natural comes. Got a lot of these bear books. That's very scary. This is The Man-Eaters of Kimon by Jim Corbett. Great movie. It was made around this, and it was remade, I think, fairly recently. No, that was Savo with Val Kilmer. The Ghost in the Darkness is what that's called. That's very scary and very creepy. It's got nothing to do with demonology or any of that jazz. They tried to put some spiritual impetus on it, but what it was a mother and a subadult male cub that killed quite a few people in Savo in Africa. These people were trying to expand the railway, and these lions were predating upon them as they were trying to do that. And then, of course, you have a classic, African Game Trails by Theodore Roosevelt. And one of the things that actually, in my mind, gave some credibility to the Bigfoot stuff was there was a book that Teddy Roosevelt wrote, and in that he actually talked about a Bigfoot occurrence where 2 gentlemen were out in a spike camp. They were hunting. And so a spike camp is a camp that you kind of set up and you hunt from that. So we talked about with the chimpanzees, you go 13 miles in, you would set up a camp there and that'd be your base camp. And so then you would hike in loops and come back to that. That's how you hunt. You basically make a big daisy, a big flower. You go out in loops to hunt from that until you find the spot that you think would be a good spot to stay. And then you hunt there and you go back to camp each day trying to minimize your scent that you're putting in that spot. And there was 2 hunters and trappers. They were trapping the rivers, catching beaver and those type things for pelts. And they were hunting bigger game, deer, moose, elk. I think a moose was predominantly what they're looking for. And so people that have smelt moose have a distinct musk to them. And some of the people that talk about Bigfoot, they say there's a skunk ape smell to them. But if they smelt the musk of a moose or a very large animal, I would imagine that's fairly similar. So some of that might be confusing folks of what you're actually smelling, right? Because big animals, they don't shower, right? Their armpits aren't washed. They're not wearing deodorant, so they have an odor to them. So maybe some of that suggests what some of the things are. Well, these gentlemen that Teddy Roosevelt was talking about, one was a older tenured hiker, hunter, guide, and they were trapping, and one of them went back to the camp, and when he got back to the camp, everything had been moved around. Everything had been messed with, and some things had been broken. So they thought automatically some other person had come in there and dealt with this and done this and jacked with their stuff, and they were trying to figure out what's going on. And long story short, they decided, well, when we leave here, we should stay together because something big is here. And one morning, right before they were deciding to leave, they decided there was too much going on because this continued for days. They were deciding there's too much going on. They don't have any control. They're going to pack up the next morning and leave. Anytime you hear that in a story, you're like, oh boy, here we go, right? So that night, they're staked up in their camp. They're taking, trying to lay down for the night and go to sleep. And they smell something and see something outside, and they look, and there's this massive creature standing outside the tent that they see. It's not even 15 yards away. They can't really make it out completely, but they see it standing in the woods 10 to 15 yards away, and they can smell it and they can see it move. So if you're laid somewhere in the dark, the only light they had was the light flickering from the fading fire. And here this Bigfoot is in the woods, or this giant creature, they didn't know what it was at the time, was in the woods, and they figured out at that point, based on the tracks that they had seen, that this could be the animal that keeps tearing up their camp, because it's absolutely massive. And they'd found tracks that were too big to be a human's, and they knew it was something. So they decided, all right, tomorrow we're going to grab our gear and we're going to get out of here. That's the mistake everyone always makes. They got to go grab their gear, right? So the one guy gets up early, he leaves the camp, goes down to get his trap, see if there's anything else in it, to get all that and bring it back out. And the other gentleman was going to put up camp and be ready to go once the guy that went away came back. So when the guy came back to the camp, before he got there, he felt like it was eerie and scary. So he stopped and just stopped, waited, listened, looked around, right? He got very slow to see if anything was watching him before he could hear anything. And he didn't hear anything at all. There was no noise at all, which was creepy in itself, because no matter where you're at, there's always insect noise, there's always plant noise, there's always animals doing stuff, birds and rodents, whatever it may be. There's always some background noise, but at this point, this gentleman said it was completely silent. So as he walked into the camp, the place was torn apart. So at that point, he knew there was trouble. So he instantly started calling his companion's name to try to get his attention. And he called and called and called, and then he walked around to the back side of the camp. He just kind of circled the camp instead of walking into it. When he came around the back side of the tent, he saw his companion there on the ground, broken up pretty bad. So apparently this creature had come back and killed his campmate. So that, of course, was enough for him. He started booking it. He ran, hauled butt to get out of there, and got back to town. And ultimately, they all went back. A bunch of guys went back, and they got his camp. They got the body of the other guy. But this is a story that you think is an imagined thing, but the tracker that survived ended up being a tracker and mate of Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy said that this was one of the most honest people he knew. The guy wouldn't lie about something like this, and Teddy was an upstanding character as well. So basically, you had a one-party confirmed story of a situation where a man was killed, and then you also saw the fact that the man was actually killed, and it was a animal mauling of sorts. He was bit, but the bite didn't match a bear or anything else, or the thing had just picked him up, crushed him, and kind of bit him while he was doing that. So long story short, you have a story right there that kind of anchors the story or the myth about that creature in this country at a time that the country was still very wild, right? So my point is, there's plenty of stuff to talk about than the evil stuff that is. Now, I will say this. I do think there's a benefit if you study like I do. Okay, this is not for most people. But I have an encyclopedia of occultism. And I use this from time to time to study the things that are evil. I in no way think those things are fun to revel about or participate in. But at the end of the day, if there's an enemy, I want to be able to put up the best defense and have the best offense against that enemy. One of the books that I referred in the top 5 books the other day is a way that I expect to be able to prepare and fight the enemy as well. So just a few notes today and some recommendations around scary, scary things, that it doesn't have to be occultism or evil or witches or any of that other stuff that we talked about earlier. There's cryptozoology, there's actual zoology, and there's the history of man based on the villages and the towns we were raised in and the mythology that we come from that can be studied and storied this season. It doesn't have to be worshipped or revered, but that can be something that you do in lieu of the demonology and the Ouija boards and all the stuff that it is truly inherently evil if you want to do some things to have a creepy party. And you can call it a creepy party instead of a Halloween party. You can call it, something like that instead of the other. You don't have to celebrate spirits to be able to have a party that leaves people creeped out a little bit during this season. There are plenty of Bible verses about avoiding evil, but understand there are just as many Bible verses about avoiding foolish controversies and strife. Titus 3:9 says, avoid foolish controversies and strife. And the majority of us every single day are on some type of social media where that is all it is. It's just noise about nonsense. So Proverbs 4:15 says, avoid it, do not pass it by, turn away from it, and pass on. Romans 16:17 says, now I urge you, brethren, to keep your eye on those who will cause dissensions and hindrances rather contrary to teaching you, which you learned, and turn away from them. Excuse me. But I read those to say there are far more evil things that we deal with daily for most people than spooks and goblins. Okay. So that's kind of the point of the channel. Just want to put some ideas out there, kind of put some entertainment ideas out there. There's a couple of things online. Missing 411 is one. That stuff will creep you out. Mr. Ballin is another that he tells tales that some of them are demonic and demented, but just know that there's plenty of creepy things online that if this season that's something you want to do, there's ways to do it without getting into the demonology of the suggested holiday. So if you like subject matter like this, please subscribe. We study a lot of stuff on this channel. A lot of it is biblical and comes from the Bible background. But I do read a lot, and what I put on here is things that I find entertaining. And I just had a first conversation this year about Halloween and should people celebrate it. I personally don't. The biggest thing about Halloween is November 1st, because all the candy goes on sale, and we can buy all that up and have that throughout the year if we want it. So that's kind of the bigger holiday for me, is the day after when all the candy is on sale. But whatever you do, be safe. Stick to the Bible. There's plenty of ways to do things and have fun and not have to have it be of an evil origin. And the more you study those things, the more you look into them, the more options you'll give yourself and your family. Well, I'm Ben. If you like subject matter such as this, please like, please subscribe. Be good.